Okay, first we're going to start with Dr. Ed Pajor, who is the Anderson Chisholm Chair in Animal Care and Welfare at the University of Calgary, Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, Department of Production Medicine. I've known Ed for a long time. He's an internationally recognized individual in animal welfare and has been involved in research, teaching, as well as creating and working on some of the Canadian audits. He originally was in Purdue after he got his PhD at McGill and has been at Calgary for how long? 7 years, wow. And what he's going to talk about today is studying animal welfare at the Calgary Stampede. Please welcome Ed Pajor. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic set up at a good level? Okay. Somewhere here. Other way. Well, good morning again, and thank you very much to the organizing committee for inviting me to speak to you today about a couple different topics. The first one I'll talk about this morning is animal welfare at the Calgary Stampede. I'm an animal welfare scientist, and I must admit that 7 years ago when I left Purdue and moved to Calgary, I had no idea that I'd be working in something like the Calgary Stampede and rodeos. My background is that, well, when I went to Calgary and I went to the Stampede, it's the first rodeo I ever went to. No idea what was to be expected. How did I get involved with the Calgary Stampede? Well, the Calgary Stampede is a very large rodeo, largest rodeo in Canada. They're located in Calgary. Calgary is the fourth largest city in Canada, so it has about 1 million, 2 million, 3 people, depending on when you count. And they came to my door one day and said, we'd like to put together an animal welfare advisory committee to help us understand animal welfare, to help us move forward in this issue, which is such a big deal, and we don't really understand a lot about it. Would you mind being part of this committee to help us out? Well, I had to think about it a little bit and said, as long as you're willing to do things. If what you really want is window dressing, I'm not interested. If you really want to address the issue of animal welfare and start looking at animal welfare, I'd be happy to get involved. That led, after a couple of years, to some of the research that I'm going to talk about today. But let me first tell you a little bit about Stampede and set the stage for you. Calgary Stampede has over 7,500 animals that come to the 10-day Stampede. The Stampede really is the equivalent of what you might consider the state fair for agriculture. It's really a large organization that, although it has the rodeo and chuck wagons, which generate the most animal welfare concern, it also has all the exhibits and that you would find at a state fair. All the provincial commodity organizations come. They have the horse shows, they have 4-H competitions, the whole deal. They look at their role as doing education, exhibition, and competition, and they work in 3 main areas: agriculture, rodeo, and chuck wagons. The Stampede's a non-sanctioned rodeo. That gives us a special kind of situation because it becomes a rodeo that is not part of the professional circuit. What that means is they can set their own rules. They don't have to abide by any type of general set of standards and rules set up for competitions across North America. Okay? So because they can have their own set of rules and they're non-sanctioned, they can do things outside the box. They can push the envelope on certain areas that may not get pushed on. Okay? They have significant prize money. Therefore, they attract the best competitors in the rodeo area. Okay? It is not simply the Wild West. In Alberta, we have the SPCA and we have the Calgary Humane Society, and they have unfettered access to the Stampede grounds during the actual rodeo. And they are organizations that are empowered by law to enforce the Alberta Animal Protection Act. So it's not as if people can do whatever they want to do. In terms of veterinary care, the Stampede now hires for their 10-day event over 10 veterinarians. In chuck wagons, they do over 2,500 chuck wagon horse examinations. Heavy horse pull, they're doing 50 examinations. Rodeo, before and each and after every event, animals are inspected. And in terms of daily inspections, by the end of the rodeo or by the end of the Stampede, when you look at agriculture and everything else, you're looking at over 17,000 individual animals, 17,000 different vet inspections, and records are now being kept on all of those. There have been some significant changes made at Calgary Stampede since the Animal Care Advisory Panel came into place. We developed something called the Codes of Practice. Codes of Practice are kind of a standard document, or a document used in Canada to point out requirements and recommendations for care and handling of different species and different groups, such as there's a Code of Practice for care and handling of beef cattle or dairy cattle. The Stampede, under the direction of the advisory panel, created a Code of Practice for the rodeo, and it's based on legal requirements, on industry codes, and on individual rules for each event. Those codes of practice are written up to address things like rodeo, using animals in agriculture. The Calgary Stampede has a ranch where they keep their bucking animals. They also have a beef cattle operation ranch as well, and the codes of practice apply there. And one of the things they've done is, because so many animals come to the Stampede from different stock contractors, what they've done is they've said that if you want to participate or bring your animals and be part of the Stampede, you need to abide by our rules. We don't care what you do at the rodeo you were at 2 days ago. We can't control what you do at the rodeo 2 days from now, but while you're here at Stampede, you're going to abide by the rules that we have. And they've written those into the agreements. So what? They've got a code of practice. Big deal. Right? They've written into the contracts. Okay. So what? What's a code of practice? Piece of paper. Right? If you don't enforce it, if you don't regulate it, all it is a piece of paper. If you don't respond to it, what you find as a result of things. What has the Stampede done? I was really impressed when they decided to actually try to carry out animal welfare assessments and audits, essentially, of the Stampede animals and the facilities. Historically, they had third-party audits. They had an independent auditor who would come on and audit the different events, audit the animals, do an assessment as to whether or not there's any injuries, animals being well looked after, etc. That third-party audit was done by Jennifer Woods. She's a PACO-certified auditor, does a lot of work for major companies in Canada and in the United States, Smithfield, and works a lot at slaughter plant auditing and those types of things. She's now become their second-party auditor. And what I mean by that, she's no longer completely independent. That may seem like a step backwards to a certain extent, but what they found was that Jennifer was pointing out so many things that could be improved, so many things where they could work with the volunteers who are there looking after the animals, whether it be in agriculture, exhibits, or other displays, or in rodeo itself, or chuck wagons, that they hired her in-house to help develop programs in-house and train people that work within the organization. Therefore, because she has a more direct link and is employed by the Stampede a certain part of the time, it becomes a second-party audit. There were no such things as rodeo assessments or audits. I don't know whether there's very many in the world other than the one that Jennifer actually developed for the Stampede. What I can tell you is that they're done every year. We get reports. The Animal Care Advisory Panel gets reports every year, and the results of those assessments are taken very seriously by the Calgary Stampede executive, and changes are made as a result. And expensive changes are made. Millions of dollars are spent on replacing things like chutes and handling facilities, etc. We now do animal care tracking. Prior to the development of the Animal Care Advisory Panel, what have you, the Calgary Stampede, if you were to ask them a question like, how many animals got hurt on this event or that event? Or how many animals had to be treated that were on the agricultural displays? They wouldn't be able to give you an answer. It was something that they treated, dealt with, the veterinarians took care of, but nobody really recorded. So we've developed a complete animal care tracking type of situation for the Stampede. Veterinarians now fill out forms, and those are kept track of electronically, and we can use that information to look for risk factors associated with particular events or particular contractors, what have you, as part of that as well. So again, we have the main areas of animal use: agriculture, rodeo, and chuck wagons. When we think about agriculture, it is incredible the number of animals. People think about a state fair, showing animals, having people around, moving animals, handling animals from one facility to the other facility, keeping people safe, those types of issues. Okay. Exhibition and show competition can be stressful to animals. Right? We know we've had situations, so there was a state fair in California where a dairy cow on exhibition got away. People couldn't control it, and because they were afraid that the animal was going to trample somebody, they decided to handle it by shooting it. Okay? We've had other situations where horses simply that are on exhibit or are being shown in rings have died. And when you think about the display of animals and the use of animals in situations like state fairs and situations like this pavilion here is actually designed for, right? You know, you have 4-H shows, we have commodity animal demonstrations, heavy horse pulling, team penning, cutting horses, stock dog trials, cowboy up, riding demonstrations. How many of you enjoy sheepdog competitions? Any? Do any of you ever worry about the sheep? Right? Very few people do. Right? What's the response of the sheep? Right? Are those sheep under a stressful situation, being rounded up by a potential predator? The animals, the cattle used in team penning or other events. Right? We talk about the competition aspect of it, but we have to remember that these are animals that we're using for lots of different purposes, and their welfare counts as well. Okay? They're often neglected, I find, in the situation when it comes to animals used in fairs and competitions. In terms of rodeo, we have lots of different events that are part of rodeo: the tie-down roping, steer wrestling, barrel racing, and the rough stock events, which is bareback, saddleback, and bull riding. These animals are used during the Stampede 1 to 2 times. So that's over the 10 days. Occasionally you might get an animal used 3 times. The rest of the year, an individual animal may get sent out to about 10 different rodeos, and those can be anywhere in North America. So there's a fair bit of traveling involved for those animals, but they are used about 10 times a year. The rest of the time, these animals spend their lives on a ranch in Hanna, Alberta. That's a picture of the ranch in Hanna, Alberta. It's 22,000 acres. That's 400 horses and 80 bulls. People often we argue about animal welfare or discussions around animal welfare that deal with quality of life issues. Okay? I think this is one of those situations where, you know, you have to think about the quality of life some of these animals may be having outside of their use. In terms of chuck wagons, there's been a great deal of work done in terms of addressing animal welfare issues at the Stampede. Chuck wagon racing probably receives the most attention of any event at the Stampede. When there's a wreck, animals will die. Opportunity for a lot of injuries to occur. And it's received a great deal of vet attention. They developed a program called the Fitness to Compete program. And this is specifically to look at the fitness of the animals. Chuck wagon racing. That is a picture of chuck wagon racing. The animals do a figure 8. They leave a circle and then they race around the track. It's basically a horse race with 4 horses pulling a wagon behind them. And it's simply a wagon race. Okay? But you can imagine if one of those animals goes down in the front, you've got a real big problem coming behind them. Okay? Veterinarians are very much involved with this program and already providing a lot of leadership in this program. Horses are all microchipped prior to arrival at Stampede. Why are they microchipped? They're microchipped so we can actually follow who's being used in the race. There's rules as to how many times an animal can be used, because they race the same outfits, not the same animals, but the same drivers race every day for 10 days in a row. So by microchipping them, we can identify each individual animal. They're given an inspection when they arrive on park and prior and after each competition. The drivers have to submit an inventory of what horses they're going to be using before the competition and keep track of who's being used and how much they're being used. There's a post-race inspection of all horses when they leave the track, and animals have mandatory rest days. They've done things where they've enhanced the track. So now what used to happen historically, there are about 8 heats in an evening. The animals would run the track, and by the end of the night, they're feeling that the track was getting too hard and difficult for the horses. So they actually, after every 2 races, they harrow the track to try to soften it up. And they decrease something called the number of outriders, so the number of extra riders that are on the track at the same time. There's random testing, there's drug testing of the horses. Of the team that wins, there's a random animal drawn from that, and then there's random animals drawn from the other groups as well. When it comes to the drivers, the same thing applies to the drivers. There's alcohol and drug testing done on the drivers as well, trying to increase the fitness for the competition of the animals. So there have been some very significant changes in terms of what's happening at the Stampede. They've got their codes of practice. Okay? They have third-party assessments or second-party assessments now. A new animal care tracking system. They've put in place new rules involving certain aspects of different competitions that I didn't get into today. And they have a zero-tolerance policy. What they're trying to do is they're trying to create a situation, and they've adapted a policy saying, we're trying to minimize the risk to these animals to zero. We're going to do everything we can, accepting the fact that we're going to use animals for these types of competitions. We're going to try to do everything we can to minimize the risk. And we're going to get veterinarians involved and bring animal welfare people involved and try to get that down to zero. What's the reality of the situation? Well, think about the situation for something like a Stampede or a state fair, if you will. In this case, they have 7,500 animals that show up during the 10 days at their competition. They own about 100 animals that actually compete in the rough stock events and other events. Okay? Most animals, therefore, 7,400 of them, are owned by other people. They're on the Stampede grounds for 1 to 2 days at the most. Some are there for less than 12 hours. And the host of the event has no control over what happened to the animal before it arrived. Right? Has very little control over what happens, but they're still held responsible by the public for anything that may happen to an animal during the actual Stampede event. So I think the changes have been significant. I've worked with a number of companies around the world that have dealt with the animal welfare issue. One of the things that's amazing to me is that the animal welfare program and issue has been adopted by people at the highest level of management at the Stampede. It starts at the top, it works its way down. Okay? For the most part, they're ahead of many commodity organizations that have audits and assessments, because very few of them, people will have codes of practice, people will have regulations they want to follow, but very few organizations actually have on-farm assessments being done. I think it's just the beginning. I think this is an area in terms of animal welfare, and I'm not really talking about rodeo and chucks per se, but the use of animals at fairs is an area that is very much under acknowledged in terms of potential animal welfare issues. Okay? And I think we really are just at the beginning of that whole issue. I'll talk a little bit about the research that we've been doing at the Stampede. And I love these pictures because they actually make it look like I'm actually doing something there at the Stampede. And in actual fact, it's usually always the graduate students or something like that that are really doing the work. We have complete access and can set things up wherever we want to set things up. One of the our initial research question was a question about whether animals whether animals like to actually perform. It doesn't matter where I go or who I talk to. When I'm talking to people who use animals for any purpose, for the most part, if I talk to people about their horses before a competition, say, my horse loves to compete. Right? They get excited about competing. Right? I talked to somebody who was racing dogs. And he said, you know, I drive down this road, and when I turn down this gravel road to the racetrack to race my dogs know where they're going. They know it's Sunday afternoon, and we're going to the track, because they get all excited in the back and get interested in what's going to happen. When I talked to people at the Stampede, they said, our animals love to buck. Right? They love to perform. Right? So that was the first question. Now, surely we can ask the question, do animals like to do that? But it's a very difficult question to ask, especially when you're first starting out. There's ways to get at that question using preference and motivational testing methods, but we're not there yet in terms of sophistication in facilities to actually be able to do that type of work. So we asked the question, rather than do they like to perform, do they find this aversive? Because we have this whole controversy out there around the use of animals for lots of different purposes, and rodeo is no exception, right? Where is the argument is that, oh, no, our animals love to buck, versus this is cruel and horrible, terrible treatment, right? We should never use animals for these types of purposes. So surely we can ask the question whether or not they find it aversive. We have easy ways of trying to get at that and to do that. Dr. Temple Grandin came up to the Calgary Stampede a few years back, and we started thinking about and designing projects in which we could work on the whole issue of whether or not animals find performing or getting ready to perform to be aversive. We decided that there was really limited in what you can do during an actual real live rodeo, right? I mean, there is a limitation as to how much time in the handling facilities and how much blood sampling is an opportunity. What can we actually do? Well, we can look at the behaviors that the animals are actually performing. Right? So we can do things that look like eye whites and tail flecks and defecation when the animals are being kicked. We can look at how the animals are being loaded. We can look at something called infrared thermography, which I'll explain in a little bit to try to get an idea of what's happening with the animals. We have 3 planned papers coming out of the work that we're doing. First paper is the behavior of bucking bulls prior to rodeo performances. So a lot of our work is limited to right up to the point the animals are actually released into the arena. We don't have any data about what happens to animals when they're actually performing. So we're doing that on bucking bulls, and we're doing that on horses as well that are used in the rough stock competitions in terms of novice and comparing novice and experienced animals. We know that novice animals react more to being in the chutes than experienced animals. And so we're trying to see how different that actually is. And we're trying to use infrared thermography as a non-invasive measure of stress to look at the response of these animals as well. So in terms of the bulls, that paper was just published last year, or this past year, in June. Became available online, and it's an applied animal behavior science paper. Again, what we're looking at is we're looking again at mostly the behavior of the animals prior to the event. We're looking at how those animals are actually handled as well. The objectives of the paper describe the behavior of those animals used in bucking events and determine if those behaviors are associated with certain stimuli that can be considered negative stressors or a condition response to specific performance cues within the rodeo environment. So why are the animals behaving the way they're behaving? And what are they actually doing? I was really frustrated by the fact that we had to start at this point. When you scan the literature for simple descriptions or anything to do with welfare of animals at a rodeo, you find no scientific information at all. Right? Essentially, this is one of the only studies that has so far been published to look at the behavior of animals used at a rodeo. Okay? I think it's really important to insert some data, some information, some facts into the whole discussion about do the animals, is this extremely aversive and terrible use of animals? Or is this an acceptable use of animals? Or how do the animals feel about the situation themselves? Okay. Otherwise, we end up with different camps just yelling at each other without any information, any data to support what's happening. We scored the handling of the animals. Again, the argument has always, that I had been hearing was that Oh, you know, you're going to be so surprised when you get there, Dr. Pajor, because the animals are really poorly treated. You really won't want to be doing anything there. Where the other people say, oh, we look after our animals wonderfully, we handle them well. These in the back chutes, the animals are actually, whoop, that was not the right button. Well done, Matt. Here we go. The animals are actually held in holding pens in the back. And we evaluated the handling of the animals as they were being brought up into the loading chutes, which is here, and then the bucking chutes at the end. We scored the behavior of animals at those 4 different points and looked at how the handlers were actually moving those animals along. This gives you a little bit better idea. To the back pens, there's an alleyway represented by the red arrows. We have somebody with a video camera up top here shooting the entire handling of the animals, keeping track of what type of handling methods the handlers are using on those animals. Are they treating these animals really aversively, or are they handling gently? The results of the handling investigation demonstrated that for the most part, very few animals are treated in a way where we have a lot of highly aversive. We have some use of a prod on a bull. It's the only time any electric prod is ever allowed is when they're trying to load the bucking bulls. On horses, they're not allowed at all. For the most part, you can see the frequency of the behavior on the right, on the x-axis here, and the number of loadings on the y-axis. The frequency demonstrates that for the most part, the handlers aren't doing anything. Okay? Vocalizing, whistling to a certain extent. You can see when it gets down to the frequency of 1 and 2, they're waving their arms, they're waving paddle rattles. We do have some occasions where they hit animals. Okay? So it's not perfect, but when I look at the data and you watch the animals being loaded, it is surprising how quickly those animals load and how little aversive handling actually is done. When we look at the frequency of the bull behaviors during loading, again, we looked at whether the animals balked or charged or kicked, ran into the gate or the fence while they were actually being loaded. We do have some situations where if you want to see handlers jump fences, watch them when they try to move bucking bulls. We had a situation where we had a bull that just didn't want to go, or actually what he wanted really was to go back and be with his buddy. Okay? That animal, I think, jumped 3 8-foot-high fences on the way to try to get back to his buddy. Okay? It was an extreme situation. It does happen. Okay? For the most part, however, when you look at balking, charging, kicking, again, the frequency is incredibly low. The animals know what their job is, know pretty much where they're going, and move forward fairly easily once you get them out of the pen moving forward. When we looked at the actual behaviors of the animals in the chutes prior to performance, again, the result was really surprising. The animals, for the most part, were calm, had soft brown eyes. Some of them, yes, got upset being in. You could tell that there was animals kicking, some animals trying to get out. But for the most part, it was much, much less than we thought we were going to see. And we've noticed this other phenomenon where the animals will actually sometimes get the wrong cue. We see it with horses and we see it with bulls as well. Where if that gate moves a little bit because they're waiting for that gate to be swung open, it's almost like a cue to the animal to perform. And you can see these animals start going into their pattern that they do when they come out into the arena. So sometimes they start bucking within the chute, but that's often a mistake because of the cue that's given to the animal. You start moving that gate, the animal thinks it's going to be released, and these animals have a routine, right? So it's like the cowboys all have books on these animals and say, oh, that's so-and-so. When he comes out of the chute, he's going to go down here to the left, spin to the right, do this, da-da-da-da-da. He does it every time. That's the pattern. And you can see that pattern sometimes starting in the actual chute. But again, for the most part, we didn't see a lot of evidence of animals being completely terrified, being in the chute. Very few fear responses. Yes, there were some. So there are things that we need to look at in terms of how that could potentially be made better, but very, very few. So few pools displayed agonistic behaviors. So the story is that we walked away going, some cases it was some of the most boring research I've done because the animals just kind of did nothing. But we do know that there's things that we can do to improve the situation. We're using infrared thermography to try to look at, so we're doing exactly the same type of study right now. We're writing the paper right now on horses to look at the handling of the animals just prior to their performance as well. But we also wanted to look at infrared thermography. Infrared thermography is being suggested, it's being used in lots of different things by veterinarians and other people. People have different responses to the use of it for different things. It has been used as a non-invasive measure of stress in a number of research studies, especially involving horses, actually. Some European riding horses have studies on them have suggested that infrared thermography, temperature of the eye in particular, is a good indicator of stress in animals, and in some cases better than things like heart rate monitors and blood pressure monitors. So we wanted to see whether or not we could actually use infrared thermography and taking a picture of the eye, and in particular the lacrimal caruncle area of the eye, so the lower part here, which is highly responsive to emotional stress. It goes up fairly quickly. To see whether or not we could see a difference between novice animals and experienced animals. Again, we know that experienced animals are more common shoots than the more novice horses. Right. So we want to try to see whether we use it as a measure of stress, look at the eye temperature, horses and bulls, and is it associated with specific behaviors or specific stimuli. And when we're getting at that, we're looking at, are there certain things that are going on just prior to the animal's performance that the animal really is responding to? We don't know the answers to that yet. We have some ideas. So just an example, taking the maximum eye temperature as well as the lacrimal caruncle area of the eye, as the red triangle is, a picture of what we actually see through our infrared camera. We then put that all through a software system that tells us what the temperatures are like. The data is we don't have a lot of the data in yet. It is an incredibly difficult measurement to get because you have to understand we're taking pictures pretty much every 3 minutes while the animals are in the chutes. While the animals are in the chutes, there's cowboys, there's people, there's handlers. Some animals are being used, other animals are being held. And we're there with our little camera trying to zoom in on the eye and focus and get a picture. If you're interested in the backsides of cowboys, and most of the volunteers for my studies have been young females, students, it's a great place to work. Okay? However, if you're interested in eye temperatures and pictures, it's a little more difficult because there's so much going on. What we do find is that we find that the novice animals, initially with our small sample size, actually do show higher eye temperature than the experienced animal, which correlates well with our behavioral studies and suggests infrared thermography may be a tool for trying to get a measure of stress in a non-invasive manner. How much time do I have left? Good. So there are other equine studies to share with you. So Dr. Renaud Leguillet is a colleague of mine who's also doing work at the Calgary Stampede. He is an equine physiologist and specialist. And he's just been appointed a new chair in performance animals at the University of Calgary. Renaud's work on chuck wagons and chuck wagon horses has been really quite interesting. We have a problem with these animals having aneurysms or heart attacks while they're racing. So he's been looking at the issue of arrhythmias. How is racing tolerated by the horses? Is there testing used to identify animals at risk? So he's looking at markers like troponin in terms of to see whether any of these animals have heart conditions or heart problems. He's asked the question and he's used force gauges, strain gauges, to look at how hard it really is for race horses to pull a wagon at 65 kilometers an hour. Some people argue that these animals are really a lot of physical exertion in order to do that. The answer seems to be it's almost zero once they get going. They just fly around the track. There's no problem for 4 racehorses to pull the wagon. Okay. And he's looking at VO2 use and different things like that. So there's a picture of his fancy monitor on the front of that horse, where he's looking for the VO2 max. He's doing some cardiac screening in terms of troponin. He's looking at bleeding in barrel racing horses. So barrel racing horses have bleeding that occurs, so he's trying to do some work on that. And we've just submitted a paper for publication on physiological challenges associated with shrinkage for heavy horses. Heavy horse pull, or draft horses pulling these large weights and heavy weight. And what happens is that with draft horses, like a lot of other competitions where weight's involved, animals come in and are weighed in the night before. So it's like a boxer or a wrestler going to a weigh-in, going to a match, and they're trying to get them in the lowest category possible, right? So they're off food, they're off water, shrinkage occurs, and the question is, and they get weighed in, and the question is, so are these animals in some kind of stressful situation or not? What's the physiological stress associated with that? The result is the animals do arrive in a situation where they are fairly dehydrated and there are some physiological stresses, but they respond very quickly. So they'll come in, they'll get weighed in, and now the rule is they get food and water right after weigh-in. We don't wait till the next morning anymore. If it's the middle of the night they're arriving, doesn't matter. Right? The animals get food and water right away, and they seem to recover fairly quickly. It does make a huge difference to what class of weight those animals end up in. We also do work at the Calgary Stampede, and this isn't to look at the data because I've shrunk it all, so it makes no sense at all. But we use our activities at the Calgary Stampede to ask more simpler questions about that summer students can actually work on. So historically, there was no water or food, or there's no water or food provided to animals after the event. They'd be off water and food since that morning. They would go, they would perform. The idea is that they perform better on an empty stomach, or not being so heavy is the idea that the competitors put forward. So we convinced the Calgary Stampede to add drinkers to a lot of the pens for after the event, because it was like, really, these animals, why aren't these animals given food and water before they get on a trailer after competition? And so we just set up a simple study where we monitored the use of drinkers, and the student from University of Guelph, University of Calgary, ran that as a summer student project. And so then we asked the question, well, this year we asked the question, is one drinker enough, or do we need 2 drinkers? Because sometimes you end up in a pen with 10, 12 animals, and you have one drinker location. So again, we set up a situation where we had a pen with 1, a pen with 2. Summer students did a nice little project on that, determined that 1 drinker was sufficient, adding 2 didn't increase the number of horses or the amount of time spent drinking, etc. So not only do we have new management practices being brought into the Stampede, we're actually doing things to evaluate, are those management practices actually working? And we've done a study looking at some post-event behaviors of bucking bulls, trying to get an idea, do these animals settle down after they compete, or are they still very ramped up and aggressive, or what is their response after competition? The answer seems to be that if you were to go back to the pens and look at the animals 2 minutes after the event, then they got back into the pens, you wouldn't be able to tell which animal had just competed and which animal had not. The animals calm down fairly quickly. Yeah, they come back, they're alert, they find food, they find water, they find some buddies, and you just kind of see them go, settle down. And we're looking at specific behaviors that would tell us that. So, the take-home message this morning, in terms of the Calgary Stampede work and the rodeo work and everything else, is that there is research being done. We have a very strong relationship with the Calgary Stampede at the University of Calgary. They're a big part of our community. They're an organization that is involved year-round with the Calgary community. They see themselves as a conduit between agriculture and the urban setting. And we have people in education involved with some of their educational programs, etc. So this isn't the only thing they do. This is the thing that they're best known for. But they're a big part of our community, and we're involved with them. Our focus is on the Stampede in terms of the use of animals for display, but look, animals for display, performance, and competition are used everywhere. Right? Every weekend there's all kinds of competitions going involved using animal use. Right? And we have an obligation that regardless of what we use them for, that we treat them as well as we can and look after their welfare. Thank you very much.
We've got time for questions. If anybody's got a question for Dr. Pajor. I know it's early. Somebody should have a question. Can you come up to the microphone?
The question is, what drug testing do they do? They're looking for everything, and I'm not 100% sure. They're looking for everything from the use of performance-enhancing things to pain management type things. So the idea of using animals that are sore and being given certain drugs such as Banamine or some other type of NSAID, they'd be testing for those as well as steroids in particular.
I've got a question.
Sure.
One of the things that people always ask about is the calves that are roped and when they're yanked.
Yep.
Give us your thoughts on that.
Calf roping. So the question is thoughts about calf roping in terms of what's being done there. It's a difficult one. It's probably one that causes the greatest amount of controversy when it comes to the rodeo events. There's been a bunch of stuff that's been done at the Stampede itself to address some of the issues associated with calf roping, such as a change in rules in terms of jerk down, which is when animals are pulled off their legs and brought down to the ground. There's no reason for that type of extreme handling, or that extreme type of roping to occur. It's one of the things that's really interesting when we see at the Stampede is that the first 2 days, the people who are competing haven't quite figured out that they're at a place that has a different set of rules. And you'll see more jerk downs occurring in the first and second day. And then and what happens if you jerk a calf down is that you're disqualified. So if you're disqualified from that day's running, that means you don't have a time. That means your chances decrease in terms of winning. By the second, third day, the people who are there competing, the ropers who are there competing, actually learn how to remember to control their slack better, and the issue doesn't happen. We did some preliminary work looking at calf roping, looking at physiological indicators, cortisol, corticosterone, looking at heart rate, and some behavior stuff as well. And it was a really interesting study. It's as if the animals, once they learn that they're going to be roped, expect to be roped. It's bizarre. One of the messages that we're hearing and starting to gather a little bit of information on is that if we're going to use animals in calf roping, we need to break those animals in. The people who do and train calves for calf roping tell me that the first time an animal is roped, they don't like it very much at all. They struggle. Second time, it's less. By the third time, and if you've ever watched calf roping in a professional situation, the animal kind of lies there and waits because they kind of know what's going to happen to them. The issue is that we haven't looked at the things that you're actually talking about in terms of the extreme, the damage that's potentially done to the animals the next day or the day after, what actually happens to those animals. So the initial assessments that the veterinarian does immediately after the event, he'll come out and check all the animals before they compete. He'll check out all the animals after they compete. But there's a lot of things we can't see. And so I think it's something that requires a lot more study if you wanted to put data on it. Alternatively, it is the one event that you'll know when there's a problem with calf roping because the entire crowd will go, right? It is a very difficult thing to do. It's one of those events which is an event which isn't fitting with our relationship with animals any longer. Historically, so this is, calf roping is a man versus animal type of competition. We don't live in a society that really uses those types or approves of those types of competitions. We prefer animals working with people, right? So the idea of using your horse to perform certain tasks, using the horse and the animal as a team in show jumping, right? That is much more the way the society looks at the use of animals. I think that's a good thing. The human versus animal competition thing I don't think is a set of values that's really represented in society any longer. That's a long-winded answer trying to get around the question. Yeah.
Does that mean that you also do not do horse tripping at Calgary?
Pardon me?
Does that mean that you also do not do horse tripping?
There is no horse tripping at Calgary. The question was, is there horse tripping at Calgary? And the answer is no. There is. So we've got the calf roping and steer wrestling are probably the two most dramatic man versus animal types of events that occur. People don't seem to worry about man versus bucking bull all that much. And I've been told that if I really want to study stress, I should study the cowboys and not the bulls. It really it's a completely different area for me. And like I said, I've been very impressed with how responsive the Stampede has been, and the fact that they're allowing us to carry out the research is we're pretty fortunate in to be able to do that, because there's no requirement for them to allow us to do that type of thing.
Well, you have free access, don't you?
Yep.
You can go wherever you want. There's no place that says, well, you can't leave.
No, that'd be a very quick way for me to just leave.
Yeah.
No, that's not why I'm there. I'm there because I worry about these animals. I'm interested in the behavior and welfare of these animals that are being used. Question.
I think if I remember the numbers right, 17,000
That
visits, 10 veterinarians, 10 days. Does that turn out to be sufficient numbers, or?
question.
You guys have to come down to the microphone so that everybody can hear the question. Yes, I know.
She's tough. Ooh. You better stay on her good side for the rest of the day.
So if I remember the numbers right, 17,000 inspections or exams, 10 veterinarians, 10 days, 170 per veterinarian, roughly?
It's a lot.
Does that? Yeah, it seems like maybe not enough staffing, depending on what the exam amounts to.
Yeah. So the exam can be highly superficial in the case of walking by an animal on display, for example. You've got sows in a crate. You've got dairy cows there. I mean, the commodity organizations are there as well. But there is a walk by in that particular case where they're not expecting there to be any real problem, but they still walk by. If there is a problem, there's still a form and things that need to be filled out and taken care of that way. Since we implemented the animal tracking program, we've heard a lot more from veterinarians about the need to fill out all this stuff, and is it really necessary, and what are you going to do with that data and things like that. And it's a fair point. In terms of staffing, you could always use more help, and and you can see it on the veterinarians by the end of the Stampede. They're exhausted. A lot of this stuff is occurring in night shows and things like that. So if chuck wagons need to be hydrated, or animals that are used, competitions go to 10, 11 o'clock at night. Displays go to 10, 11 o'clock at night, whether it be in agriculture or in the chuck wagon competitions. So there's an awful lot of stuff through the night. A lot of our veterinarian students actually get a chance to get involved and help out and those types of things. So they're not officially veterinarians, but they're part of the team that helps out as well. They're not counted in the 10. And the staffing has increased dramatically over the last 5 years because of the need to have information and to make sure the animals are being well looked after. So I believe they used to have 2 or 3, and now they're up to 10. And when they didn't have to do all the tracking, it was possible. But now with it, it's put a lot more work on them. And they also have the role of, there is an official Stampede veterinarian, privately, he has a part of a private clinic, but he works primarily with the Stampede all year round. He's kind of, and the veterinarians are brought out as spokespeople to talk about the issues when something does go wrong, right? And that can be anything from the rodeos, chuck wagons, to agriculture things. With animals get hurt, If people notice that there's a problem, then, or a small injury, then the veterinarians are asked to stand up and speak about it publicly, what they're doing to address that issue.
Any other questions? People use thermography on the roping calves to look for injury.
Could you use thermography to look for injuries in calves? And I think the answer is yeah. I think it'd be worth looking at. I think that there's still other things that we need to look at other than just thermography, but it is a possibility to look for increased blood flow to injured areas and that type of thing. Yeah.
You have to say this because I don't have a microphone, but what about when those calves are not performing, what's their quality like?
So when the calves are not performing, they will be on a large ranch that's about an hour south of Calgary. There's a main supplier of that. They're basically out on ranch. They are used a lot, though, in... One of the things that we have to realize is that I don't want you to get the message that everything's sunny and rosy in the land of rodeos. Right? One of the elements here is that we're working with one of the premier rodeos in the country. Right? They've got money to invest in things like an animal care advisory panel and audits and veterinarians. They have the best of the best in terms of animals, in terms of competitors. What I'm hoping by getting involved with something like the Calgary Stampede is this idea and concern about animal welfare used for animals in these types of events or on display actually filters down. And we can see it starting to happen. We see some of the very large independent rodeos in the United States actually coming up to Calgary and saying, what are you guys doing about animal welfare? We hear all this stuff that you guys are doing about animal care, and you have a program and an advisory panel. What is it all about? And so they're starting to raise that issue, and people are starting to think about that issue more than they have in the past. Going back to the calves can be used at the Stampede. Calves can be used at high school events, all kinds of different events. But they do keep track of who's going where, and there's certain size requirements and things like that as well.
I can be loud.
Be loud, Jim.
Have you evaluated the man versus animal aspects of it? Because historically, the rodeo really was to sharpen the skills, and it was a survival thing almost for the workers. The Mexican rodeos are being criticized tremendously, and it's become part of their culture, part of their heritage. And they're proud of doing it, yet they're told it inhumane and cruel. Are you looking at the old traditional rodeo, or when the ranchers get together and have their own
Ranch rodeos.
rodeo? Boy, that's an important part of their culture, and it's not. It's still entertainment, but it's still sharpening their skills for their job.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that question because Jim wasn't all that loud?
So I think the question is, have I been looking at other types of rodeos, including Mexican rodeos or ranch rodeos, and what do I think about the fact that it is part of their culture, used to improve their skill set, the recognition that these types of events are more than just competition, but they have a role to play in terms of maintaining culture, and that has a certain importance as well. Yeah. I guess I can respect that the culture component is important, but I also think that cultures change, and I think we're at a place where our relationship with animals and our appreciation for animals and what they're capable of, we're learning more about that. And I think that that although tradition is important, there are things that we need to identify as targets that are acceptable or not acceptable while maintaining that tradition. So let me shift from rodeo to something like branding. And in Western North America, in ranching country, brandings are huge cultural traditional events. Family members come from different places. It's a time of year to celebrate the spring and start the spring processing, and branding has this huge cultural component. And that's wonderful. But maybe we could do something about minimizing how much branding we have to do, or the different types of ways we can do it, or maybe we could do something about pain management if we have to brand. And people brand for lots of different reasons. It's not simply because they like to brand. There's lots of real reasons that branding does occur. So maybe we can keep some of the culture in place, but we can recognize the pain that animals are experiencing and do something to deal with that. And the message that I'm hearing is that that's actually happening, and it's a generational change, where in Canada we have products that we can use for pain management on cattle, and we have actually oral products, and we have now for meloxicam, Medicam that we can use, and perhaps there's something that becomes part of the tradition as well. If you're going to brand, or you have to brand, okay, keep the tradition of having a branding event, but maybe we could add the pain management and make it part of the tradition as well. So there's ways of including the welfare aspects to it, I think.
Do you have to, in some states in the U.S. it's legal, that you have to, I mean, it's mandated that you have to brand?
So in some states, I'm told that in some states here, it's actually mandated, it's actually necessary, it's legal, a legal requirement that you have to brand. We have a situation where we send cattle to the United States and we have to put a great big CAN brand on their back. So it's kind of like government mandated, I think government mandated cruelty where you just have to brand animals type of thing, no pain mitigation, things like that. Banks require it in a lot of cases for ranchers in Canada. Animals that are going on free range, for example, there's no way to identify them afterwards. And in the last few years, the cattle prices have been so high. You think about cattle rustling being something out of the movies, it's real, right?